Florence, a city of breathtaking beauty, brilliant art, and chilling ambition. For centuries, one family stood at its heart, pulling strings, building empires, and surviving against odds that would shatter lesser mortals. The Medici. They were not just bankers, they were power brokers, art patrons, and targets. Their story is a relentless roller coaster of triumph and terror, a fight for their very existence played out on the grand stage of Renaissance Italy. They faced betrayal from within their own city, armies at their gates, and daggers aimed at their hearts. Their survival was never guaranteed. It was earned through brutal, cunning, audacious gambles, and often sheer luck. Get ready to dive into the 8 most nail-biting, life-or-death moments that proved just how close the Medici came to being erased from history. Number 8. The assassination of Alessandro de' Medici and the unexpected rise of Cosimo I de' Medici. The year was 1537. Florence was restless, simmering with resentment under the rule of Duke Alessandro de' Medici. He was the first hereditary Duke of Florence, a title many citizens saw as a betrayal of the city's long-held republican ideals. Alessandro's rule was not popular. He was seen as a tyrant, a man who preferred pleasure to governance, relying on imperial support to maintain his grip on power. His behavior, from lavish spending to rumored scandalous affairs, fueled the discontent among both common people and the old Florentine aristocratic families who yearned for the return of the Republic. This was not a military battle with armies clashing on a field. This was a war of political survival, a struggle for the very soul of Florence and the future of the Medici family. The stage was set for a dramatic, violent turn. The key player in this specific drama was Lorenzino de' Medici, a distant cousin to Alessandro. Lorenzino was known for his love of classical literature, his witty remarks, and his increasingly erratic behavior, which earned him the nickname Lorenzacchio, meaning Bad Lorenzino. He had spent time in Rome, known for its intellectual circles and its dangerous political games. When he returned to Florence, he became a close companion to Alessandro, sharing in the Duke's more decadent pursuits. Many saw Lorenzino as a loyal friend, a fellow reveler, but beneath the surface, a different plan was brewing, a dark and treacherous plot. Lorenzino harbored his own complex motivations. Some historical accounts suggest he was a staunch Republican, horrified by Alessandro's tyrannical rule, and convinced that removing the Duke would restore liberty to Florence. Others claim he was driven by jealousy, a desire for recognition, or even a twisted sense of revenge for perceived slights. The truth of his heart remained shrouded in the shadows of his actions. On the evening of January 6th, 1537, Lorenzino invited Alessandro to his private apartments, promising him a secret rendezvous with a beautiful woman. This was a classic trap, a lure designed to catch a man known for his appetites. Alessandro, trusting his cousin, dismissed his guards and entered Lorenzino's chambers alone. The Duke arrived, perhaps expecting a night of illicit pleasure, but what awaited him was something far more sinister. As Alessandro waited in a dimly lit room, Lorenzino left him, ostensibly to fetch the woman. Instead, he returned with a hardened assassin named Michele Tavernella, also known as Scoronconcolo, a man notorious for his violent tendencies. The attack was swift and brutal. Alessandro was caught completely by surprise. The struggle was desperate but brief. The Duke, a strong man, fought back fiercely, but he was alone against 2 determined assailants in the confines of a small room. Lorenzino himself plunged a dagger into Alessandro's body. Scoronconcolo finished the grim work. The Duke of Florence, the powerful ruler of the city, lay dead on the floor of his cousin's room, murdered in a shocking act of betrayal. The immediate aftermath was chaos for the conspirators. Lorenzino and Scoronconcolo fled the scene, leaving the lifeless body behind. They escaped Florence under the cover of darkness, disappearing into the Italian countryside. The body of Alessandro was quickly hidden by his chamberlain, who wrapped it in a carpet and buried it secretly in the sacristy of San Lorenzo to prevent immediate panic and chaos in the city. The assassination was meant to be a spark, a signal for a popular uprising against Medici rule, but that uprising never materialized. The conspirators had misjudged the mood of the city, or perhaps the Florentines were too weary of conflict to rise again. News of the Duke's death spread slowly, whispered through the city's back alleys before exploding into the open. The powerful families who had opposed Alessandro saw an opportunity, a chance to restore the Republic. However, the unexpected death also created a power vacuum, a dangerous void that had to be filled immediately to prevent widespread unrest or foreign intervention. The key players in Florence, including Cardinal Innocenzo Cibo and Francesco Guicciardini, the renowned historian and statesman, gathered to decide the future of the city. They faced a critical choice attempt to restore the Republic or select a new Medici ruler who would continue the family's reign. The choice was not simple, as each option carried significant risks. The old Republican families saw their chance, but the memory of past exiles and the fear of imperial backlash loomed large. It was in this moment of profound uncertainty that a young, relatively unknown figure emerged. Cosimo de' Medici, a mere 18-year-old at the time, was the son of Giovanni delle Bande Nere, a celebrated military captain from a junior branch of the Medici family. Cosimo was not considered a direct heir to Alessandro's dukedom. The senior branch of the family from which Alessandro descended seemed to have ended its male line. Cosimo was a distant cousin, living a quiet life on his country estates, seemingly more interested in hunting and outdoor pursuits than in politics. He was largely overlooked by the powerful Florentine elite, who were busy scheming for control. Many thought he would be a malleable puppet, a weak link who could be easily controlled and eventually set aside once the Republic was restored. The influential families, including Guicciardini, saw him as a safe choice, a young man without strong political connections or a large following in the city. They believed he would be easy to manipulate. However, Cosimo possessed an ambition and a shrewdness that no one had anticipated. When he was brought to Florence and proposed as the new head of the family, he accepted with a quiet determination that belied his youth. He quickly demonstrated that he was no puppet. Once appointed, Cosimo moved with astonishing speed and ruthlessness to consolidate his power. He outmaneuvered the older, more experienced politicians who thought they could control him. He secured the allegiance of the imperial forces stationed in Florence, ensuring that his position had the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a crucial ally for any ruler in Italy. He also systematically suppressed any Republican opposition, showing no hesitation in executing those who challenged his authority or sought to undermine his rule. He established a new, centralized government, stripping away the remnants of Republican institutions and laying the groundwork for a truly autocratic state. The assassination of Alessandro, intended by Lorenzino to liberate Florence, had instead paved the way for a stronger, more absolute Medici rule under Cosimo. Lorenzino, living in exile, would eventually be tracked down and murdered years later, his dreams of Florentine liberty unfulfilled. Cosimo, the first of Medici, would go on to become one of the most powerful and effective rulers in Florentine history, transforming the Duchy of Florence into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and solidifying the Medici's hold on power for centuries to come. His unexpected rise from obscurity to absolute ruler was a testament to his sheer force of will and political acumen, a dramatic turning point born from an act of brutal family betrayal. The future of the Medici family, which seemed to hang by a thread after Alessandro's murder, was not only secured but dramatically strengthened under Cosimo's iron grip. Number 7. The Siege of Florence and the Iron Fist of Alessandro de' Medici. The year is 1527. Florence is in turmoil, a city once again wrestling with its destiny. After a brief period of Medici absence, following the sack of Rome, the Florentines had seized the moment to re-establish their republic. This was not a minor disagreement, it was a deep ideological chasm between those who championed the city's republican traditions and those who supported the return of the powerful Medici family. For the Medici, particularly Pope Clement VII, born Giulio de' Medici, regaining control of Florence was not just about family pride, it was about solidifying their power base, ensuring the Pope's own stability in Rome, and maintaining the family's long-standing influence over the city that was their ancestral home. The very survival of the Medici family's prestige and political standing in Italy depended on their ability to reclaim Florence. The stage for this epic confrontation was set by the devastating sack of Rome in May of 1527. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V's mutinous troops, unpaid and out of control, unleashed unimaginable horror on the Eternal City. Pope Clement VII was besieged in Castel Sant'Angelo, his authority shattered, his treasury plundered. Florence, sensing this moment of extreme papal weakness, expelled the Medici again. The Republican government was restored, and for a short time the old ideals of liberty and self-governance flourished. However, this period of Republican freedom was fragile, built on the shifting sands of Italian politics. Pope Clement VII, once he had recovered from the trauma of the sack of Rome and secured a fragile peace with Emperor Charles V, made it his absolute priority to restore Medici rule in Florence. He saw the Republican government as a direct threat to his own authority and to the family's legacy. To achieve this, Pope Clement VII entered into a new alliance with Emperor Charles V, known as the Treaty of Barcelona in 1529. One of the key provisions of this treaty was Charles V's promise to help the Pope restore the Medici to power in Florence. This meant war. A massive imperial army, composed of hardened veterans from the sack of Rome and new recruits, began its march towards Florence. The Florentine Republic, knowing what was coming, braced itself for a siege. This was not just a battle for political control, it was a fight for the very identity of Florence. The city prepared for war, building fortifications, gathering supplies, and raising an army of its own. The man appointed to command the imperial forces was Philibert of Chillon, Prince of Orange, a seasoned military leader. The siege began in October 1529. Florence was a well-fortified city, surrounded by sturdy walls and a determined populace. The Florentines were led by their elected officials and a military council, and they appointed figures like Francesco Ferrucci, a fierce and dedicated commander, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, the celebrated artist, to oversee the city's defenses. Michelangelo, despite his artistic genius, was a passionate Republican and took his role as superintendent of fortifications seriously, designing new bastions and strengthening existing walls. The city knew it was fighting for its life, for its freedom, and against the return of a family they had twice expelled. The siege was long and brutal. For 10 grueling months, the imperial army encircled Florence, cutting off its supplies and launching repeated attacks. The defenders, driven by their Republican fervor, fought with incredible bravery and tenacity. They endured starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. Stories of heroism emerged from the besieged city. Women and children played their part, helping to fortify the walls and care for the wounded. The Florentine forces launched daring sorties outside the walls, engaging the imperial troops in skirmishes and attempting to disrupt their supply lines. Francesco Ferrucci, in particular, led a series of desperate attempts to break the siege from outside, trying to bring relief supplies and rally support from other Tuscan towns. His efforts, though courageous, ultimately failed. He was eventually defeated and killed in battle at Gavinana in August 1530, a devastating blow to the Florentine morale. The siege was not just a military operation, it was a war of attrition. The imperial forces, though suffering from disease and the cold Florentine winter, had superior numbers and resources. The Florentines were slowly starving. The city's treasury was depleted, and the constant fighting wore down their spirit. By August 1530, after nearly a year of relentless pressure with no hope of external relief and their supplies dwindling, the city was forced to surrender. The terms of surrender were harsh. The Florentine Republic, after a valiant and desperate struggle, ceased to exist. The consequence of this surrender was the restoration of the Medici. Alessandro de' Medici, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, or perhaps of Pope Clement VII himself, was installed as the new ruler of Florence. He was not just the head of the family, he was proclaimed Duke of Florence, a hereditary title that fundamentally changed the nature of Florentine government. This was the end of Florence as a republic and the beginning of its transformation into a ducal state, paving the way for the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Alessandro's rule, backed by imperial power, was authoritarian and centralized. He established a standing army, built a fortress to control the city, and suppressed any remaining republican sentiments. The city, which had fought so fiercely for its freedom, now found itself under the iron fist of a Medici duke, a position secured by a bloody and protracted siege. The Medici had not only survived this challenge, they had consolidated their power, establishing a more formal and absolute rule than ever before. Their ability to leverage the immense power of the Holy Roman Emperor proved to be their ultimate salvation in this critical period. Number 6, the sack of Rome and the second expulsion of the Medici from Florence. The year 1527 was a catastrophic turning point for Italy, and for the Medici family it presented another existential threat. This was not a battle fought directly by the Medici on a field of war, but a devastating event that shattered the very foundation of their power and led directly to their second expulsion from Florence. The central figure in this unfolding disaster was Pope Clement VII, born Giulio de' Medici, a man of immense influence and ambition, yet one who struggled to navigate the treacherous political landscape of Renaissance Europe. His very survival, and thus the Medici's, hinged on his ability to manage the overwhelming power of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The roots of this crisis lay in the complex power struggles between the major European powers, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, King Francis I of France, and Pope Clement VII. The Pope, attempting to maintain a delicate balance of power and protect the Papal States, found himself caught between these two giants. He had initially allied with France against Charles V, a decision that proved to be disastrous. Charles V, fresh from a victory against the French at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, felt betrayed by the Pope's shifting allegiances. His imperial army, a vast and unruly force, composed largely of German Landsknechte and Spanish mercenaries, was already in Italy, many of them Lutheran and deeply hostile to the Catholic Church. This army was also unpaid and increasingly mutinous, a ticking time bomb waiting for a spark. In May of 1527, that spark ignited a conflagration. The imperial army, having marched south through Italy, found itself outside the walls of Rome. Their commander, Charles III, Duke of Bourbon, was killed in the initial assault, leaving the massive army leaderless and completely out of control. What followed was a horror unprecedented in Rome's long history, the sack of Rome. For 8 brutal months, the Eternal City was subjected to an orgy of looting, destruction, and violence. The churches were desecrated, palaces ransacked, women violated, and countless citizens murdered. The scale of the destruction was immense, and the psychological impact on Europe was profound. It was seen by many as divine judgment, a cataclysmic event that signaled the end of an era. Pope Clement VII, a Medici pope, found himself trapped in the Vatican, desperately trying to negotiate his safety. He eventually fled to Castel Sant'Angelo, the ancient fortress, where he was besieged by the rampaging imperial troops. He lived under constant threat, facing humiliation and near starvation, until he was eventually forced to surrender. He paid a massive ransom for his life and freedom, agreeing to humiliating terms that effectively made him a prisoner of the emperor. The prestige and authority of the papacy, and by extension the Medici family who held its highest office, were shattered. The Pope, a figure of immense power, was reduced to a state of utter helplessness. News of the sack of Rome and the Pope's humiliation reached Florence with astonishing speed. For the Florentines, who had chafed under Medici rule since their return in 1512, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The Medici family had been restored to power in Florence, largely through the influence of the papacy and the support of the various popes from their family line. With Pope Clement VII effectively neutralized, the Medici's local support in Florence evaporated. The Republican factions within the city, eager to throw off the yoke of Medici dominance, seized the moment. The Florentine revolt was swift and decisive. Led by prominent Republican families and fueled by popular discontent, the citizens rose up against the Medici. The current Medici ruler in Florence, Cardinal Silvio Passerini, Clement VII's representative, found himself isolated and without military support. The young Ippolito de' Medici, another illegitimate son of the family, and Alessandro de' Medici, who would later become duke, were in Florence at the time. They were in an incredibly vulnerable position. The mood in the city was fiercely anti-Medici. The people demanded the restoration of the Republic. The city's bells rang out, signaling the popular uprising. There was no major battle, no bloody street fight. The Medici, lacking the support of the Pope and facing overwhelming popular opposition, realized their position was untenable. Ippolito and Alessandro, along with the other Medici representatives and their supporters, were forced to flee Florence. They departed the city on May 17, 1527, less than 2 weeks after the sack of Rome began. They left behind a city that immediately declared itself a republic, electing new magistrates and tearing down symbols of Medici rule. The Florentines, having endured the sack of Rome, now celebrated their own liberation from what they considered Medici tyranny. This second expulsion was a profound setback for the Medici. Their grip on Florence, which had been restored with such effort in 1512, was once again broken. Pope Clement VII, still reeling from the sack of Rome, now faced the humiliation of having lost his ancestral city. The family's position in Italy was severely weakened. However, the Medici were renowned for their resilience. This crisis, though devastating, would set the stage for their eventual return to Florence, a return that would require even greater force and ultimately lead to the city's final transformation from a republic into a hereditary duchy. The sack of Rome, a disaster for the papacy, inadvertently provided the Florentines with the chance to briefly reclaim their freedom, proving once again how precarious the Medici's power truly was, subject to the whims of larger European conflicts. Their survival depended on their ability to weather such storms and rebuild their alliances no matter the cost. Number 5. The return of the Medici and the Terror of Prato. The year 1512 marked a brutal turning point for Florence, and a dramatic moment of survival for the Medici family. For 18 long years, the Medici had been exiled from their beloved city, a consequence of the French invasion of Italy in 1494 and the rise of the fiery preacher Girolamo Savonarola. During this period, Florence had experimented with various forms of republican government, though it was often tumultuous and marked by internal divisions. The Medici, however, never gave up hope of returning to their ancestral home and reclaiming their former power. This was not just a political aspiration, it was a deep-seated drive, fueled by family honor, ambition, and the conviction that Florence could not truly prosper without their guiding hand. The architect of this return was Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni was a cunning and patient politician, deeply committed to restoring his family's fortunes. He had spent his years in exile, cultivating powerful allies, particularly with the newly elected Pope Julius II, a formidable figure known as the Warrior Pope. Julius II was obsessed with driving foreign powers out of Italy and restoring the temporal power of the papacy. He saw the Florentine Republic, which had maintained a neutral stance in the ongoing Italian wars and sometimes leaned towards France, as a nuisance and an obstacle to his plans. The Pope was also keen to reduce the influence of other Italian states and consolidate papal control. The opportunity for the Medici to return arose from the shifting alliances of the Italian wars. In 1511, Pope Julius II formed the Holy League, an alliance primarily aimed at expelling the French from Italy. The League included Venice, Spain, and eventually the Holy Roman Empire, where Florence, still a republic, found itself in a precarious position. It had traditionally maintained a policy of friendship with France, a policy that now put it directly at odds with the powerful Holy League. The Florentine government, led by Piero Soderini, a well-meaning but ultimately ineffective leader, was hesitant to abandon its French alliance, hoping to avoid involvement in the large-scale conflict. This neutrality, however, was interpreted by the Holy League as open hostility. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, now an influential figure in the Holy League, saw this as his chance. He persuaded Pope Julius II and the Spanish forces, led by Raymond de Cardona, the Viceroy of Naples, to march on Florence and restore the Medici. The Spanish army, a highly disciplined and brutal fighting force, began its advance through Tuscany. The Florentine Republic, ill-prepared for a direct military confrontation with such a powerful enemy, found itself in a desperate situation. The city's defenses were weak, and its militia, largely composed of citizen soldiers, was no match for professional mercenaries. The Spanish army's first target was Prato, a smaller city just outside Florence. It attempted to fortify Prato and sent some of their militia there, hoping to slow the Spanish advance. They believed that by showing resistance, they could force the Holy League to negotiate. However, their preparations were inadequate, and their resolve was soon tested. On August 29, 1512, the Spanish troops launched a furious assault on Prato. The city's defenses quickly crumbled. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Spanish soldiers, enraged by the unexpected resistance and eager for plunder, unleashed their fury on the city. The sack of Prato was horrific. Thousands of civilians were killed, churches were plundered, women were raped, and homes were burned. The screams of the dying and the smoke rising from the burning city served as a chilling warning to Florence. The news of the sack of Prato reached Florence swiftly, bringing with it a wave of terror and panic. The Florentine government and its citizens were utterly demoralized. The brutality of the Spanish army, far exceeding any expectations, sent a clear message: resist, and your city will suffer the same fate. The will to fight evaporated. The Florentine leaders, including Soderini, realized that continued resistance was futile and would only lead to their own city suffering the same unspeakable horrors as Prato. There was no military solution left. On August 31st, 1512, just days after the sack of Prato, the Florentine government surrendered. Piero Soderini, the Gonfaloniere for life, was forced to resign and flee the city. The Medici family, led by Cardinal Giovanni, returned to Florence in triumph, welcomed by a faction of their supporters, but more importantly, by a terrified and exhausted populace. Their return was not a popular uprising, but a military imposition. The cardinal, shrewd and calculating, immediately set about reorganizing the government to ensure Medici control. He dismantled the Republican institutions, replacing them with councils loyal to the family. Key positions were filled with Medici partisans. The 18 years of Republican rule were over. The return of the Medici was a moment of profound victory for the family, but it came at a terrible cost for Florence and for the city of Prato. The sack of Prato became a grim symbol of the ruthlessness required to secure power in Renaissance Italy. For the Medici, it was a demonstration of their ability to leverage powerful external forces, in this case, the papacy and the Spanish military, to achieve their objectives. This military triumph secured their survival and paved the way for Giovanni de' Medici's eventual elevation to Pope Leo X, an event that would further solidify Medici influence on the European stage. The family had not only survived their long exile, they had returned stronger and more determined to impose their will on Florence, ultimately transforming the city's political landscape forever. Number 4. The rise of Savonarola and the first expulsion of the Medici. The year 1494 was a watershed moment for Florence, a time when the city was swept up in a spiritual and political tempest that ultimately led to the first expulsion of the powerful Medici family. This was not a military conflict in the traditional sense, but a fierce ideological struggle, a battle for the soul of Florence waged by a fiery Dominican friar against the very foundations of Medici power. The survival of the Medici hung precariously on their ability to navigate the storm of religious fervor and popular discontent. The central figure in this drama was Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican preacher who arrived in Florence in 1490. From the pulpit of the Duomo, his sermons thundered against the perceived moral decay of the age, particularly the excessive wealth, luxury, and paganism he associated with the Renaissance and, by extension, the Medici. Lorenzo the Magnificent, the head of the Medici family at the time, recognized Savonarola's charisma and influence. Initially, Lorenzo tolerated the friar, perhaps even admired his intellect, but he also understood the potential danger of a man who commanded such popular devotion and openly criticized the established order. Savonarola's pronouncements were deeply felt by the common people, who often felt exploited and overlooked by the city's elite. Savonarola's popularity grew exponentially as he preached apocalyptic visions of God's impending judgment on Florence and Italy. He prophesied that a new Cyrus would come to cleanse Italy, a foreign king who would punish the wicked and restore virtue. His condemnations of worldly pleasures, usury, and the corruption of the church resonated with many, creating a powerful, almost messianic movement within the city. For the Medici, whose power was built on banking, patronage, and a sophisticated worldly lifestyle, Savonarola's message was a direct challenge to their legitimacy and their very way of life. The friars' influence created a powerful counter-narrative to Medici rule, one that promised a return to a more austere, republican ideal. The situation became critical with the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in April 1492. Lorenzo had been a master statesman, a skilled diplomat, and a beloved patron of the arts. He had navigated complex political waters, balancing rival factions within Florence and maintaining a fragile peace with other Italian states. His death left a massive void. His eldest son, Piero de' Medici, known as Piero the Unfortunate, inherited the mantle of leadership. Piero lacked his father's charisma, political acumen, and diplomatic skill. He was impulsive, arrogant, and poorly equipped to handle the escalating internal and external pressures facing Florence. He surrounded himself with young, sycophantic companions, alienating many of the established powerful families in the city. The new Cyrus that Savonarola had prophesied soon appeared on the horizon, King Charles VIII of France. In 1494, Charles VIII, driven by ambitions to conquer Naples, led a massive French army across the Alps and into Italy. This invasion sent shockwaves across the peninsula, destabilizing the fragile balance of power that Lorenzo the Magnificent had worked so hard to maintain. Florence found itself directly in the path of the French army, and Piero de' Medici made a series of catastrophic decisions. Instead of rallying the city's defenses or attempting to negotiate from a position of strength, Piero panicked. He rode out alone to meet King Charles VIII, offering humiliating concessions without consulting the Florentine government. He surrendered key Florentine strongholds, including Pisa and Livorno, to the French without a fight, essentially inviting the French army into the heart of Tuscany. This act of perceived cowardice and betrayal infuriated the Florentine citizens. The people, already swayed by Savonarola's anti-Medici rhetoric, saw Piero's actions as an unforgivable capitulation and a grave insult to the city's honor. The long-simmering resentment against Medici dominance boiled over. As Charles VIII approached Florence, the city exploded in a popular uprising. The Florentine Signoria, the governing council, condemned Piero's actions and declared him a rebel. On November 9th, 1494, as King Charles VIII entered Florence, Piero de' Medici and his family were forced to flee. They left the city in haste, abandoning their palaces, their art collections, and their vast wealth. The expulsion was swift and decisive, a popular revolt against a weak leader and an unwelcome foreign presence. The Medici's vast properties were seized by the city. Statues and symbols of Medici rule were torn down. The years of their unofficial but undeniable control over Florence came to an abrupt end. With the Medici gone, Savonarola's influence reached its zenith. He became the de facto spiritual and political leader of Florence, guiding the city to establish a new theocratic republic. He implemented strict moral reforms, organizing bonfires of the vanities, where citizens burned luxury goods, gambling instruments, and secular art. He preached a purification of the church and challenged even the authority of the Pope. However, his radicalism and his political challenges soon led to his own downfall, as the Pope eventually excommunicated him, and the Florentine elite grew tired of his rigid rule. Savonarola himself was eventually arrested, tortured, and executed in 1498. But for the Medici, the 1494 expulsion was a profound shock, a moment of near annihilation. Their power, built over generations, had crumbled in a matter of days due to a combination of internal dissent, weak leadership, and external invasion. Their survival was now a matter of navigating exile, rebuilding alliances, and waiting for the opportune moment to reclaim their lost city. This experience deeply impacted the younger generation of Medici, particularly Giovanni, who would later become Pope Leo X, and Giulio, who would become Pope Clement VII. They learned valuable lessons about the fragility of power and the necessity of leveraging both spiritual and temporal authority to secure their family's future. The first expulsion was a stark reminder that even the most powerful family in Florence could be brought to its knees by the shifting tides of politics and popular opinion. Number 3. The War of Florence and Lorenzo's daring diplomatic gamble. The year 1478 was perhaps the darkest moment in the history of the Medici family up to that point, a time when their very lineage was nearly extinguished, and the city they effectively ruled faced utter destruction. Following the horrific Pazzi conspiracy where Giuliano de' Medici was brutally murdered and Lorenzo the Magnificent himself narrowly escaped death, the conflict immediately escalated beyond a mere internal Florentine struggle. This was a direct war declared by powerful external forces, and the survival of the Medici, and indeed of Florence, depended on Lorenzo's audacious and deeply risky diplomatic gamble. The Pazzi conspiracy, orchestrated by rival banking families, disaffected Florentine nobles, and crucially, sanctioned by Pope Sixtus IV, aimed to violently overthrow Medici rule. When it failed to kill Lorenzo, the aftermath was swift and brutal. The Florentine populace, surprisingly loyal to the Medici, despite their republican ideals, rose up in a wave of vengeful fury against the conspirators. Many Pazzi family members and their allies were publicly executed, and even the Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, was hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. This swift and violent retribution sent a clear message, but it also provoked the Pope. Pope Sixtus IV, whose nephew Girolamo Riario was deeply involved in the plot, was enraged by the execution of his archbishop and the failure of the conspiracy. He immediately placed Florence under an interdict, a severe ecclesiastical punishment that barred all religious services in the city, effectively condemning its people to spiritual damnation. Beyond the spiritual condemnation, the Pope formed a powerful alliance with King Ferrante of Naples, an old enemy of Florence, and declared open war on the city. The forces of the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples, commanded by the ruthless Federigo da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, began to march towards Florentine territory. Florence found itself isolated and under immense pressure. Its traditional allies, including Venice and Milan, offered little concrete help. The city was facing a two-pronged attack from a powerful coalition, and its economy, already strained by the costs of war, was under severe duress from the papal interdict. The people of Florence, who had initially rallied around Lorenzo, now began to feel the heavy burden of the war. Supplies were scarce, trade was disrupted, and the continuous threat of invasion loomed large. The war raged for over a year, marked by skirmishes, sieges of Florentine towns, and devastating raids on the countryside. The forces of the League of the Papal States and Naples were superior in numbers and experience, and they inflicted heavy losses on Florentine territory. The war was draining Florence's resources and morale, pushing the city to the brink of collapse. Lorenzo understood that Florence could not win this war militarily. A continued stalemate would only lead to slow strangulation, and outright defeat would mean the end of Medici power and likely the subjugation of Florence. It was in this desperate moment, when all conventional options seemed exhausted, that Lorenzo conceived of an incredibly daring and personal plan. He decided to undertake a solo diplomatic mission directly to the court of King Ferrante of Naples. This was an act of extraordinary courage, bordering on recklessness. King Florence was known for his cunning, his ruthless ambition, and his occasional habit of imprisoning or even executing those who came to him seeking peace. Lorenzo was effectively putting his own life in the hands of his sworn enemy, leaving the security of Florence to face an unpredictable king. His own advisors were stunned by the audacity of the plan, many fearing it was a suicide mission. In December 1479, Lorenzo de' Medici, accompanied by only a few trusted companions, secretly departed Florence and sailed from the port of Pisa for Naples. The journey itself was fraught with danger, traversing hostile waters. Upon his arrival in Naples, Lorenzo placed himself completely at the mercy of King Florence. For 2 long months, from December 1479 to February 1480, Lorenzo engaged in intense negotiations with the king. He used all his legendary charm, his sharp intellect, and his persuasive eloquence to convince Ferrante that continued war was not in Naples' best interest. He argued that the real threat to Italian stability was not Florence, but the growing power of the papacy and the possibility of foreign intervention if Italy remained divided and weakened by internal conflicts. He emphasized that a strong and independent Florence was a necessary balance in the complex web of Italian city-states. Lorenzo played on Ferrante's vanity, his desire for peace, and his inherent distrust of Pope Sixtus IV. He also offered substantial concessions, though the exact terms of their agreement remain somewhat debated by historians. What is clear is that Lorenzo managed to forge a personal bond with the king and convinced him that a separate peace with Florence would ultimately serve Naples' strategic interests better than continuing the war alongside an erratic pope. The negotiations were tense, filled with suspicion and high stakes. Lorenzo was acutely aware that a single misstep could lead to his imprisonment or death. Against all odds, Lorenzo succeeded. In March 1480, a separate peace treaty was signed between Florence and Naples. Ferrante, convinced by Lorenzo's arguments and perhaps impressed by his courage, agreed to withdraw his forces from Florentine territory. This was a stunning diplomatic triumph. The peace with Naples completely undermined Pope Sixtus IV's war effort, isolating him and forcing him to eventually make peace as well, though he refused to lift the interdict on Florence until the following year. Lorenzo returned to Florence in triumph, hailed as a savior. His audacious gamble had averted disaster, saving the city from prolonged war and potential ruin. This single act of diplomacy cemented his reputation as Lorenzo the Magnificent. His personal bravery and political genius had preserved not only the independence of Florence, but also the Medici family's dominant position within it. This moment was a stark reminder of how close the Medici came to being destroyed by their enemies and how critical Lorenzo's individual leadership was to their survival. He had stared down annihilation and emerged victorious, ensuring the family's continued reign for at least another decade. Number 2, the Pazzi conspiracy and the fight for survival. The morning of April 26, 1478, was supposed to be a day of solemn worship, a grand Easter Mass in Florence's magnificent Duomo, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. Instead, it became a day of brutal violence, a shocking assassination attempt that aimed to wipe out the Medici family and reshape the political landscape of Renaissance Italy. This was not a clash of armies on a battlefield. It was a desperate, bloody struggle for survival within the sacred confines of a church, a moment when the Medici stood on the precipice of annihilation. The conspiracy was the culmination of deep-seated resentments against the Medici's increasing power. While Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent had carefully maintained the facade of a republic, their influence over Florence was undeniable and absolute. This concentration of power bred envy and opposition from rival families, particularly the Pazzi, another wealthy Florentine banking family who felt overshadowed and oppressed by Medici dominance. The Pazzi had strong connections and their own ambitions. They chafed under Medici control, feeling stifled in their business ventures and sidelined in political life. They yearned to reclaim their family's lost prestige and influence in Florence, but the Pazzi were not acting alone. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of Italian power. The Pope Sixtus IV, a formidable and ambitious pontiff, harbored a strong dislike for Lorenzo de' Medici, whom he saw as an obstacle to his own territorial ambitions in Italy, particularly his desire to expand the Papal States' influence in Romagna. The Pope's nephew, Girolamo Riario, a cunning and ruthless figure, was a key instigator, driven by personal gain and a desire for power. Even the Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, was complicit, eager to gain control of Florence and elevate his own standing. These powerful figures provided the spiritual sanction and external support that made the Pazzi's audacious plan seem possible. The plan was simple in its brutality: assassinate both Lorenzo de' Medici and his younger brother Giuliano de' Medici at the same moment, leaving Florence leaderless and vulnerable. The conspirators hoped that with the Medici brothers dead, the city would rise up in their favor, overthrow the remaining Medici loyalists, and restore a government friendly to the Pazzi and their papal allies. The Duomo, during the most sacred moment of the Mass, the elevation of the host, was chosen as the location, believing that the public would be distracted and unarmed, making the attack swift and decisive. On that fateful Sunday, Lorenzo and Giuliano stood in the Duomo, surrounded by the assembled Florentine elite. As the bells tolled and the host was raised, the conspirators struck. The assassination squad assigned to Giuliano, led by Francesco de' Pazzi and Bernardo Baroncelli, lunged forward with daggers. Giuliano, caught off guard, was stabbed repeatedly, suffering 19 wounds. He fell dead on the marble floor of the cathedral, his life brutally extinguished. The plot to kill Lorenzo, however, did not go as planned. The two priests assigned to kill Lorenzo, Antonio Maffei and Stefano da Bagnone, were less accustomed to violence and hesitated. Instead, a professional mercenary, Bernardo Baroncelli, who had just murdered Giuliano, also attacked Lorenzo. Lorenzo, despite being wounded in the neck, fought back fiercely. He was quicker, stronger, and more determined. He drew a sword, used a cloak as a shield, and fended off his attackers. His companions, including the poet Angelo Poliziano, rushed to his aid, pushing the assassins back. The Duomo immediately erupted into pandemonium. Screams filled the vast space. The sacred ceremony was transformed into a scene of bloody chaos. Lorenzo, bleeding but alive, managed to escape the church, retreating to the sacristy for safety. The conspirators, realizing their plan had failed to eliminate Lorenzo, panicked. They attempted to rally the Florentine populace, shouting "Liberty and Republic," to incite a general uprising. However, they had gravely misjudged the mood of the city. The Florentines, though ostensibly Republican, had grown to love and respect Lorenzo. They saw the assassination attempt not as a liberation, but as a sacrilegious act of foreign-backed violence. The immediate reaction was swift and brutal. The people of Florence, loyal to the Medici, rose up in a furious counter-reaction. They hunted down the conspirators in the streets, showing no mercy. Francesco de' Pazzi was dragged from his home and lynched. As Jacopo de' Pazzi, the head of the family, and Archbishop Salviati, still in their clerical robes, were caught and summarily hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, the very seat of Florentine government. The city streets ran red with blood. The bodies of the executed conspirators were displayed publicly, a grim warning to any who dared challenge Medici rule. Many more Pazzi family members and their allies were arrested, tortured, and executed in the following days and weeks. The Medici loyalists consolidated their power, ensuring that no other family would ever again challenge their supremacy in such a direct and violent manner. The survival of Lorenzo the Magnificent was nothing short of miraculous. His quick thinking, his fighting spirit, and the unexpected loyalty of the Florentine people saved him, and, by extension, the Medici family from utter destruction. Had Lorenzo died alongside Giuliano the Medici, line of power in Florence might well have ended there, and the city's history would have taken a vastly different course. Instead, Lorenzo emerged from the conspiracy not just alive, but stronger. The failed plot consolidated his authority, proving to the Florentines that he was indeed their protector and their leader. The Pazzi conspiracy was a vivid, bloody illustration of the constant threat the Medici faced, and their remarkable ability to overcome even the most desperate challenges, reinforcing their grip on Florence and paving the way for their continued dominance for decades to come. Number 1. The exile and triumphant return of Cosimo the Elder. The year is 1433. Florence, the heart of the Renaissance, was a city of immense wealth, artistic innovation, and fierce political rivalries. At the center of this bustling metropolis, one family was quietly, yet undeniably rising to power, the Medici. Though Cosimo de' Medici, known later as Cosimo the Elder, or Cosimo Pater Patriae, meaning father of the fatherland, was the de facto ruler of Florence, a brilliant financier and a shrewd political operator. He exerted his influence not through official titles, but through an intricate web of patronage, strategic alliances, and his vast banking empire, which extended across Europe. This hidden power, however, bred immense resentment among the older, more established aristocratic families who clung to Florence's republican traditions and viewed the Medici's growing influence as a threat to their own standing and the city's liberty. This was not a military battle, but a deep political struggle for the soul of Florence, and the very survival of the Medici family hinged on its outcome. The primary adversaries of Cosimo and the Medici were the Albizzi family, led by Rinaldo degli Albizzi. The Albizzi represented the Old Guard, a powerful noble family, fiercely proud of Florence's republican heritage, and increasingly alarmed by Cosimo's informal but pervasive control. They viewed Cosimo as a dangerous demagogue, a man who corrupted the republican system through his wealth and popular support. They saw his influence as tyranny in disguise. For years, the two families had engaged in a subtle but relentless power struggle, using political maneuvers, accusations, and shifting allegiances within the Florentine government. The tension between them was a constant undercurrent in Florentine politics, a battle for supremacy that threatened to explode at any moment. The decisive moment came in September 1433. The Albizzi, having secured a temporary majority in the Florentine Signoria, the city's governing council, saw their opportunity. Rinaldo degli Albizzi accused Cosimo de' Medici of tyranny and of undermining the Republic. He orchestrated a vote to have Cosimo arrested and imprisoned in the Palazzo della Signoria, the very seat of Florentine government. This was a direct assault, a move designed to crush the Medici and remove Cosimo from the political scene permanently. Cosimo was suddenly a prisoner, his life hanging by a thread. The Albizzi intended to try him for treason, and many, including Cosimo himself, feared he would be executed, a common fate for defeated political rivals in Renaissance Florence. While imprisoned, Cosimo famously refused to eat for days, fearing he would be poisoned. He eventually accepted food from his sympathetic jailer Federico Malavolti, who assured him of its safety. During his imprisonment, Cosimo orchestrated a desperate attempt to influence the vote on his fate. He used his immense wealth to bribe key members of the Signoria and influential citizens, sending messages from his cell through trusted allies. He understood that while his enemies had captured him, they had not broken his network of influence. This was a critical moment for the Medici, as Cosimo's fate would determine the family's future in Florence. Despite Cosimo's efforts, the Albizzi successfully pushed for his exile. In October 1433, after intense political maneuvering and threats of popular uprising from Medici supporters, Cosimo was sentenced to 10 years of exile from Florence, effectively stripping him of his power base. He was sent to Padua and then to Venice. His brother Lorenzo de' Medici and other close allies were also exiled. This was a victory for the Albizzi, a moment when it seemed they had finally broken the Medici's hold on Florence. The Medici family, which had been on a steady ascent for decades, now found itself scattered and seemingly defeated. Their vast banking operations were suddenly vulnerable, and their political influence in Florence was seemingly erased. However, the Albizzi had gravely misjudged the true extent of Cosimo's power and the depth of his indispensability to Florence. While Cosimo was in exile, Florence plunged into chaos. The city's economy, deeply intertwined with the Medici Bank, suffered severely. Trade routes were disrupted, credit dried up, and financial panic began to spread. Many Florentine merchants and bankers, who had benefited from Medici connections and loans, found themselves facing ruin without Cosimo's guiding hand and financial resources. The Albizzi, for all their political maneuvering, lacked Cosimo's financial genius and his network of international connections. They could not manage the city's economy or provide the stability that Florence needed to prosper. Furthermore, the Albizzi's rule was not popular. They alienated many citizens, and their attempts to govern proved ineffective. The Florentines quickly realized that the city was functioning poorly without the Medici. Less than a year after Cosimo's exile, a new Signoria, composed largely of Medici sympathizers and those who had suffered financially from Cosimo's absence, came to power. They immediately moved to revoke Cosimo's exile and punish the Albizzi. In September 1434, less than a year after his departure, Cosimo de' Medici made a triumphant return to Florence. His journey back to the city was met with immense popular celebration. The streets were filled with cheering crowds, and flowers were thrown in his path. The Florentines welcomed him not just as a returning citizen, but as the city's savior. Rinaldo degli Albizzi and his allies were now the ones who were exiled, many of them for life. Cosimo, learning from his brief but impactful exile, consolidated his power more effectively than ever before. He did not seek official titles, preferring to rule from behind the scenes, using his vast wealth and his network of loyalists to control the electoral system and ensure that sympathetic members were always in power. The exile and return of Cosimo the Elder was a defining moment for the Medici. It demonstrated their resilience, their deep roots in Florentine society, and Cosimo's unparalleled ability to navigate the complex political and economic currents of his time. This battle of political maneuvering proved that the Medici were not just a powerful family, but an indispensable force for Florence's prosperity and stability. Cosimo emerged from this near-fatal challenge stronger, cementing his position as the true, though unofficial, ruler of Florence, a reign that would last for 3 decades and lay the foundation for generations of Medici dominance. His survival in this moment of crisis secured the future of the dynasty and profoundly shaped the destiny of Florence.